Hello, everyone. Today, I want to cover what I believe to be the most important event in the history of the US, which is the Civil War. And I want to do it a little bit different. I don't want to do a lot of the military history kind of thing or social history kind of thing. I want to give you a brief overview of the Civil War through four events that I think give you a very good narrative about how the war goes from a war for preserving the Union through the war about slavery, and then the event that tells us what the future held for America, right? So basically, from Lincoln's inaugural address through the Emancipation Proclamation, through the Gettysburg Address to the second inaugural address, right? So I believe these are the events that really, if you really think about it and know how to interpret them, will give you a very good idea of how the Civil War played out, right? So let's get started. All right. So as a disclaimer, I do want to repeat that, this is not like a very detailed history of the Civil War or a, social military history. There's a lot of very important battles, important people, important events. Civil Wars, it's a massive event. Again, I consider it to be the most important event in the history of the US. But what I want to do today is basically give you a very quick summary, a very quick overview, and it's also gonna help us clear some of the biggest myths about the Civil War. Like, is the Civil War about slavery? Is it about states' rights? A lot of some of those details can be seen through Lincoln's actions and speeches during the war. So this is what I want to focus on today. All right. So first things first, I want to start with the very, very beginning. A very simple fact that I'm very surprised that this is news to a lot of students, right? And this is the causes for the Civil War, right? So I guess because a lot of people have this understanding that the Civil War is about slavery, they kind of have this idea that the North declared war against the South to abolish slavery, all right? And this is a huge, huge, huge misunderstanding, right? This is not what happened, right? So let's make things clear, right? There's three events, okay? So the election of 1860, when Lincoln becomes president, follows followed by the secession. The secession by the southern states, basically because they don't want to be in the Union anymore, because they suspect that Lincoln, is very hostile towards slavery, even though Lincoln has promised that he's not gonna, necessarily abolish slavery, but they're not happy about the election of Lincoln, so they decide to secede, right? So you have the election followed by secession and then followed by the Civil War, right? So when you look at these three events, a lot of people look at it and they're like, well, where's slavery in all this, right? So slavery is in secession, right? The question is, why did the southern states secede, right? Because they believe Lincoln wants to abolish slavery, or is going to be the beginning of the end of slavery, right? So this is the first fact that I want to establish, because I think I still see a lot of misunderstandings uh, from students who are not very knowledgeable about the Civil War, right? So once we get that out of the way, Lincoln is elected in 1860. His first inaugural address is in March of 1861, and this is the first part that I believe is very important, right? Uh, the historical context of this is that Lincoln's elected in November 1860. By March of 1861, there's seven states that have seceded already, right? So during Lincoln's inaugural address, he makes it all about you all need to come back to the Union, right? He basically puts the option of a civil war. So far, the idea of a civil war is not clear. So he basically says the idea of it's in your hands. If you don't come back into the Union, then we might have a civil war, right? But I'm not going to attack first, right? You need to make the first move, because we as the Union do not accept the idea of secession, right? So the way Lincoln understood the idea of secession was that it was illegal, right? That the Union was perpetual, right? So Lincoln is not accepting the idea of secession and is basically saying, I don't believe that you all guys left. I don't accept secession. So it is in your hands to come back into the Union peacefully. And, otherwise, if you make the first move, then we are going to have a civil war, right? But it's not going to be us who make the first move, right? And he also makes some kind of like, he wants to make a type of like compromise in the idea of, you can keep your slaves, right? You are going to be able to keep your slaves. you're just not going to be able to expand slavery throughout the nation, right? So this is another way to understand Lincoln, because Lincoln at the end of the war is going to abolish slavery. Most people assume that Lincoln is an abolitionist and that always was an abolitionist, or that he always intended to abolish slavery. But the reality is that Lincoln is a middle of the road president, meaning he doesn't want to abolish slavery, he doesn't want to expand slavery. He wants to, limiting slavery. He wants to limit slavery from expanding, right? So he's not on one spectrum, he's not on the other spectrum, he's right on the middle. And this is the best way to understand Lincoln. Initially, during the Civil War, if you pay attention to the first inaugural speech, you understand already, all right? The Civil War is not necessarily about slavery yet. It will become about slavery, but not yet, not in the early years, right? Uh, in the first inaugural address, you can see it very clearly. Lincoln is making this about coming back to the Union, about keeping the Union together, right? This is mostly about, he's not accepting secession, okay? And he's willing to make some concessions, right? Basically, I'm not gonna take away your slaves, but you're not going to be able to expand slavery. You all need to come back into the Union peacefully, or else, kind of, sort of, is the context of the first inaugural address. All right, so 1861 go by, 1862 go by, and the Civil War has become more brutal and has taken a bigger magnitude than anyone imagined, right? Most people imagine this to be maybe a couple weeks, perhaps a couple months, but it's been 2 years and the Civil War doesn't seem to have an end, right? There has been some massive battles with big casualties like Shiloh or Antietam, and the reality is that the battles keep on getting bigger, the casualties keep on piling up, and we don't see an end to the war, right? So in 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And this is a big turning point in the Civil War, because now Lincoln brings the slavery component into the war, right? So in the first 2 years, the Civil War is very clearly a war about, preserving the Union, right? You don't see a slavery component on it. It's mostly just, and Lincoln makes it very clear, this is not a war about slavery, right? It's a war about preserving the Union. But that changes, right? So when most people today associate the idea that the Civil War is about slavery, I believe most of them are thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, because this is the event that now makes the Civil War about slavery. You have a big slavery component part of it, right? Because Lincoln decides that it is time to free the slaves in the rebelling states, right? So just as a point of, clearing up myths, the Emancipation Proclamation does not end slavery. It just frees the slaves in the rebelling states, right? And it's an executive order, and it's passed as an emergency, kind of like as a military recourse, right? So Lincoln sells this as, you know as a military recourse. We're gonna free the slaves in the South, and this is gonna harm all the opportunities of the South, right? It's gonna put him in a precarious position because we're gonna free your slaves, right? So Lincoln wants to abolish slavery, and this is the way that he sells it, right? He doesn't sell it as a moral action; he sells it as a military action, right? But it works, right? So now the Civil War becomes a civil war about preserving the Union, but also about, abolishing slavery. Now, towards the end of 1863, you also have the Gettysburg Address, right, which is going to be the other big event in the Civil War. It's not because it's a battle. It's not because it has, this massive casualties or a military value, but rather because if you pay attention, the Gettysburg Address, now Lincoln makes it very clear: the Civil War is about preserving the Union as much as it is about abolishing slavery, right? So what you see in the Gettysburg Address is basically Lincoln referencing back the Declaration of Independence, and basically saying, in those documents, we promise life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all those things that we've talked about in our videos about the Declaration of Independence. And it's basically saying this war is about proving if we really are that nation that our founding fathers promised. They promised all the different things, and now we're fighting this war to kind of like prove, to make sure that we are that nation. in which we are a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, right? So, and I'm summarizing this a lot, right? But the reality is that through the Gettysburg Address, we now have a new understanding of the Civil War, right? The Civil War is not about preserving the Union anymore, but it's about a test, right? The test is, are we really a nation of equality? Are we really the nation that our founding fathers promised? Or are we a nation that just talk the talk but doesn't walk the walk, right? So now the Civil War becomes about slavery. And once again, when people think about the Civil War and the Civil War being about slavery, they're thinking about the latter years of the Civil War, right? 63 through the Emancipation Proclamation, and then through the Gettysburg Address, right? But initially, the first 2 years, it was very clear the war was not about that. All right, so even though we secured huge, massive turning point victories in the siege of Vicksburg in the Western Theater of War, and then in the Battle of Gettysburg in the Eastern Theater of War, the reality is that we're not really close to finishing the war, right? We're now winning the war, but we're not close to actually securing the end of it, right? So it's all gonna come down to 1864, right? So in 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman is gonna wreak havoc during his Atlanta campaign and then the subsequent march to the sea, which eventually is going to secure Lincoln the re-election of 1864, right? And just as a parenthesis in all this, the crazy thing is that if we would have been alive in 1864 and it's April, May, June, the reality is that more than likely Lincoln is going to lose the re-election, right? He's very unpopular. People don't want to continue through the leadership of Lincoln, and Sherman is the one who secures this massive victory that almost brings the South to its knees, right? It almost guarantees the victory. And now, with a victory in hand, Lincoln becomes reelected in 1864. And now we have the second inaugural address, right? So, in this second inaugural address, Lincoln once again, kind of sort of like sets the standard to what's going to happen after the war is over. All right, so just for context, the second inaugural address is on March of 1865, and then the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse by Robert E. Lee is on April of 1865, right? So Lincoln is very aware that the war is about to be over. Appomattox Courthouse, for all intents and purposes, basically means the war is over. Maybe not officially, but it is almost done. And Lincoln is very aware of this, right? So with the 13th Amendment in the pocket, he knows he has preserved the Union and basically abolished slavery. But now he needs to start thinking about what's going to happen next. And this is the purpose of the second inaugural address, right? So here we see Lincoln's intention about, not punishing the South, right? He's basically thinking about continuing, living as brothers. And you can already see that he's planning for a lenient Reconstruction, all right? So um, he's not planning about punishment. He's not planning about, who's gonna go to jail, who's gonna be, executed, exiled, dispossessed of their property. He's not thinking about any of those things, right? So what Lincoln is doing is basically what you call winning the peace, right? And winning the peace basically means, you know, kind of sort of the easy part is winning the war. The difficult part is winning the peace. Basically means what happens after the war. How do you control this population that is obviously very hostile towards the Union, right? So what Lincoln is thinking is, rather than punishing people, rather than, kind of like continuing this tension between North and South, we should have a lenient approach. And again, he doesn't exactly outline in the second inaugural address what he wants to do, but it's very obvious that it's going to be a very lenient approach and that he doesn't want any sort of punishment towards the southern states. All right. And so the Civil War is this massive event in the history of the US. Again, and I know I mentioned it too many times already. I believe it to be the most important event in the history of the US. And, it's always very difficult to summarize and articulate all the important event that happens during the Civil War. There's way too many important people, way too many important battles. But I always found that these four events really drive the story of the Civil War, right? The first inauguration, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural address, basically really paint the picture of what the Civil War was about, right? At least in a very oversimplified, summary. But through this event, we have a very good insight into how the Civil War played out, how it went from a war about preserving the Union to a war about slavery, and then what the future held for the Reconstruction, right? So, anyways, I don't want to take too much of your time. Let me know what you think. If I'm missing any events, do you think drove the narrative, would have driven the narrative better, or if you think that I gave the correct interpretation about all these events? Okay, so let me know what you think. I'll be around and be safe. Okay, see y'all.